newspapers here reported the fact that you were on South Georgia, and presumably Buenos Aires knew too. Weren't you surprised that the Argentines didn't come to capture you?
Yes, initially we were. I mean, we thought as they had the Grytviken 13, as they're now known as, and the 22 Marines on board, they would probably want to get rid of all civilians, and we were waiting for them to come and pick us up. But as time went on, it was obviously that they weren't going to bother with small folk like us, so that's when we settled down to try and relax a little bit.
Now, of course, throughout this time, you were raising your own Union Jack. Were you just being patriotic?
Well, it was sort of a little bit of that, and I don't know, sort of taking it down, you know, little British island down the Antarctic, and tiny little hut, 8 foot by 12 miles from anywhere. It was just nice to fly the flag every now and then.
What were the first hints that you got that the British sailors and soldiers had invaded South Georgia?
Well, it was on the Sunday, at 2:15 we started hearing very heavy gun fire. I mean, not sort of machine guns, you know, really heavy things. And that went on for 2.5 hours, and we then realised that obviously something was going on there. I mean, we couldn't be sure who was winning. We obviously hoped it was the Royal Navy. And so we simply had to wait, really. But in fact, we then listened to the news, and it came on the news that night.
What were your feelings during this time, knowing the invasion was going on, wondering what had happened to you?
What during the sort of the explosions and everything else? Obviously a feeling of pride that they'd arrived, and elation to a certain point. One was always aware of what the rest of the task force were doing, so, you know, we were in fact so lucky, really. I mean, we hadn't been that involved. And relief, I think, really, that the waiting was over. It had been a long month, really.
I know you both keep journals, diaries. What were the first words you wrote in the journal that day that you knew you were going to be rescued?
Nothing spectacular, actually. I think there's, you know, something like, good news, they've come at last, or something.
The boys are here.
The boys are back.
What were the boys like when they arrived?
Oh, lovely.
Oh, fabulous.
Lovely.
I mean, what bliss.
The tiny hut at St Andrews Bay that was home for 7.5 months to Cindy Buxton and Annie Price, one of only 3 places on South Georgia where the Union Jack flew defiantly throughout the Argentine occupation of the island, a flag presented to the filmmakers for luck by the landlord of their local pub, the Bluebell, at Langham in Norfolk. The 2 women, joined by 3 scientists who trekked 15 miles from the British Antarctic Survey base at Grytviken as soon as they heard an invasion was imminent, spent many anxious moments wondering if they'd be spotted by Argentine aircraft or patrol boats, or if any Argentine troops would appear on the mountains towering above their campsite. But they never did. The only other 2-legged creatures around were some of the penguins they'd come here to film, until, that is, a Royal Marine arrived unexpectedly at their hut. He knocked on the door one morning, causing great consternation, until he said he'd been sent to protect them while the British attempted to recapture South Georgia. He spent 3 days there, just in case, teaching them how to use his 9mm Browning automatic. In all, then, 3 weeks of watching, wandering, and listening to the radio before the Black Wasp helicopter from the ice patrol ship Endurance flew in low from the sea to confirm it was all over. The Argentines had surrendered. Anxiety gave over to relief, and the helicopter pilot, Lieutenant Commander Tony Ellerbeck, might have been forgiven for thinking he'd done it all single-handed. They found the Union Jack and White Ensign flying over Grytviken harbour once again, with the destroyer HMS Antrim riding easy at anchor, twin symbols of the re-establishment of British sovereignty over the island. Nearby, the wreck of the Argentine submarine Santa Fe, holed as she headed for the whaling station jetty, her crew now safe after surrendering to the Marines. Other holes in her superstructure were evidence of the missile and small arms attack which eventually sank her, and of one shell which apparently went right through the conning tower without exploding. High on a hillside, the wreck of the Argentine Puma troop-carrying helicopter, shot down by Lieutenant Keith Mills' brave band of Marines during their 2 hours of resistance when the Argentines invaded. 3 died in the crash. And in Grytviken itself, sporadic bullet holes and shattered windows, relics of the small arms fire as the British moved back in. But incredibly, the buildings, although built mainly of wood, had survived what fighting there was to provide much-needed accommodation now for the troops. The Marines were fully in control of a harbour recaptured without any of the large-scale destruction which many had thought possible. Some got ready to take in more supplies at one of the jetties. Some kept watch, perhaps discussing how quick and easy a victory it had been, while others checked their equipment used in the attack. Hard men, still relaxed enough to ham it up for the camera. And now, with time enough to go back to St. Andrews Bay to help the women pack up their equipment for ferrying by helicopter to the waiting ship. Cindy insisted on going onto the hut roof to remove the delicate solar panels that helped charge their camera batteries. I had to do that myself, she said. One of the men would only have put his foot through them. And then their belongings were swung out to the convoy that was to take the rescued filmmakers and scientists on the long voyage north to Ascension Island, leaving far behind the bleak, remote, inhospitable and strategically important island of South Georgia. Leaving it in the hands of the Royal Marine Commandos who had won it back for Britain and who had simply no idea when they would be able to leave too. The convoy home was refuelled on the way by an accompanying auxiliary supply vessel, Tide Spring, which was also carrying some of the 180 Argentine prisoners of war. Armed soldiers kept watch over the captives as they exercised on the helicopter flight deck, proving that Britain had taken time out to think of their physical fitness. Or perhaps everyone exercises like this if a rifle's being pointed at them. At any rate, they knew they were on the way home too, that the fighting for them was probably over. By contrast, for the crew of the convoy's frigate, battle stations practice was a regular duty, to counter possible threats from long-range aircraft or from the Argentine submarines thought to be prowling in the area. The girls had wanted simply to make a film about penguins, but on the way they ran into an undeclared war and what even to them must rank as the most remarkable experience of their lives.